probably months, maybe a year of your time that you've poured yourself into this document, and then I set it aside for a week because I feel like the best edit comes after you've set it aside for a week or two, and then you can come back to it as a reader.
Sword of Omens, come to my hand. I, Lion-O, command it. Thundercats, ho! And you're watching The Dorkening.
Panel on writing and some tips on novel writing, the ins and outs, the fun, the frustrations, all those things that go on. And if you're somebody that's an aspiring writer or have any ideas or plans of wanting to put something together, this is a great way to talk to folks, to these two guys, to get to know them a little bit and to go to their tables throughout the course of the day, because once you do these things, 2 hours later you may go, oh, I got a question. So I'll introduce Alex.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, Alex Segura. I am the writer of Secret Identity, which is a mystery novel set in 1975 in the comic book industry. It won the LA Times Book Prize for mystery thriller. I've written novels in the Star Wars universe. I had a Spider-Verse novel that just came out in May, Aranya and Spider-Man 2099, Dark Tomorrow. I also have an acclaimed Private Eye series, the Pete Fernandez Miami Mystery Series, which ran for 5 novels starting in 2016 for 5 books. And I also write a lot of comics. So.
And that's how I got to know Alex.
Yeah.
I worked with Alex for a little bit at Archie. I did some marketing there when Alex was there. Alex moved to DC, back to Archie.
Yeah.
And then you're here where you are now.
Yeah, here I am, now just a writer.
And that's awesome. And over here we have David Boop. Now, David, we met yesterday. Mm-hmm. You are, I think, 4 tables down from me.
Yeah, indeed.
And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. David Boop, I'm a Denver-based writer. I have 2 novels out. The first one is a sci-fi noir called She Murdered Me with Science. And that came out originally 2008, came out again in 2015. And then my most recent novel is a weird Western mosaic novel that just came out last year in October called The Drowned Horse Chronicle Volume 1. And working on Volumes 2 and 3 right now. It's about a cursed town where your inner demons manifest as actual monsters. And I've edited many anthologies, several weird westerns, some space western, some pulp heroes. I'm working on a Green Hornet and Kato anthology right now with some really big names. I also have my first comic coming out, co-written with Kevin J. Anderson. We'll be going to Kickstarter in 2 weeks. And probably about 100 or so short stories, including a lot of media tie-in, Predator, Veronica Mars, and others. And I do mystery as well.
So we have got a world of knowledge up here. And the interesting thing is when I'm going to be really enjoying this because with my writing, so I'm a podcaster. I got to know Alex before, I think, Archie, or maybe a little bit afterwards. Mm-hmm. I was doing a comic book podcast called Secret Identity. Yeah. So then all of a sudden, like 5-6 years later, we're not doing Secret Identity anymore. And I get an email that's Secret Identity. And I'm like, what is, oh, Alex, oh, that's great. But one of the things that I do is I'm a music biographer. So I write biographies, and it's a lot different for me. I imagine the pacing and things I have to do and the prep I have to do is the same, but it's a little bit different because for me, my last book that came out in last September was about Black Sabbath called The Final Testament. And it is first album to last album. That's an easy thing to begin and end because it's done for me. They began it and they ended it. When you're writing novels, it's obviously a little bit different because you are creating the end. So when you're putting stuff together, and I'll go for you first, sure. Alex, when you're putting your books together, how far ahead are you with the writing and the plotting, or is it completely done for you before you even start?
I've come to be, over time, a pretty detailed outliner. When I wrote my first novel, I remember I had read On Writing by Stephen King, which, if you haven't read, is essential just to the art and craft of writing. And he is what we call a pantser, meaning he just flies by the seat of his pants. He just starts writing, he puts in the time every day, and he kind of just follows his muse. So I guess in the hubris of youth, when I first started, I was like, I'm going to try to do that with my first novel. But midway through the book, I realized I need some kind of roadmap. So I started it's what I call kind of the blended outline. I started outlining as I was writing. So I'd write a few chapters, and I knew where the ending was. But as I've progressed, and now I'm 8 novels in, I outline pretty intensely. It's pretty detailed, almost to the point where it becomes a first draft. Like the chapter descriptions have dialogue and little details, and then eventually I just write through the same document. But I keep it loose enough that if a character starts doing their own thing, you have to give the character room to breathe. And so, like with Secret Identity, it's a mystery that follows this woman, Carmen Valdez, who moves from Miami to New York to pursue her dream in comics. And she creates this character anonymously because her boss basically prevents her from writing any more comics, and it becomes a huge hit, and then her collaborator is murdered. And so it's a story of her solving that murder, and there was this secondary character that just showed up. And I was like, she's just going to be this kind of femme fatale type character, and then we won't see her again. But she became really integral to the third act, and she would not have been able to have done that if the outline was super tight. So there was enough room where this character could kind of weave around and change the story. With any mystery writing, I think it's helpful to know who the killer is. It's helpful to know what the resolution is, because then you can plant little clues and red herrings and things like that. But that's a gradual thing I learned over time. I was not an outliner at first, and you have to find what works for you. Some people can do it.
So David, for you, the process, what is it for you as far as taking stories and developing them?
Very similar to Alex. I started off being a pantser as well, and I lost my hard drive 3/4 of the way into my first novel, and I did not have an outline of it. So the only saved version I could find had ended at about chapter 7, which was only about 1/4 of the way through the novel. So I lost 2/4 of the novel, and I had to start over. And I was already under contract and under deadline. And I'm like, okay, so I am going to create an outline for what I remember, and then went from there. And actually, much later on, I did find some notes, and my revised version was much better than my original, including the ending. So I started outlining like that. And of course, a lot of publishers want to see an outline. They want at least an idea in the pitch that you know what you're doing, that you know how to stick the landing, and so forth. Even if it's not the landing you turn in, eventually they want to know that you can write a novel from start to finish. And so writing a pitch outline, forming some sort of a pitch deck, which I guess they're calling them nowadays, where you show also your marketing and things like that, all that ties in. So it's kind of, unless you're already established and the publishers already trust you, having an outline of where you're going with your novels is important. Now, my most recent novel, this Weird Western one, is actually a mosaic. So it's a series of short stories that combine to form a single narrative. And some of the short stories have been previously published, but I still didn't know where I was going to go with it. I had to write the new stories to fit in between the old ones. And that was a really unique experience for me, because I knew how it was going to end in one of the short stories that is in the future. I say what the ending of this one is, and I'm like, I've got to write to that, but I don't know what they're going to look like. So it was almost like pantsing again, which was kind of thrilling and a little scary.
And it's funny because as you guys were just talking, I started to realize I don't write just music biographies. I had a brand new book come out like 2 weeks ago, and it's a kid's book. Mm-hmm. So I'm sitting there going, where have I? Oh, I wrote a book about this. So I wrote a kid's book in 2015, and I have a new publisher. And the book was called Monkey See, Sea Monkey, and it was about sea monkeys coming out of the toilets because we flushed them down the toilet,
right?
Because that's what you did with them when they didn't look like they did in the comic books. And they ended up getting mixed into some things, and part of the story is what they got mixed into. And then they came back for vengeance because they wanted to know who flushed me down a toilet and why did you flush me down a toilet. So my publisher said, we want you to redo this right after the Black Sabbath book. So that takes me right out of my genre writing, because now it's like Black Sabbath and kids. And when I did this book, when I rewrote it, I went back and I'm like, this is amazing. And I started doing the outline, and that was what it was. I started remembering outline and going, I remember my notes when I first put this out, what I did like and didn't like and what I wished I did. And it was self-published, so I was in control of all of that. And the thing was, so the first part was I can't use sea monkeys anymore because we don't own the rights. And we looked into it, and it's a mess. The guy who created sea monkeys was not the most kindest human being that ever walked the planet. But we ended up having to change it to aquatic apes. So it was like trying to find that watery
Right.
primate kind of thing.
It's good alliteration.
It was better than moist monkeys, which is what it almost was. So when we're doing that and then putting stuff together, and here's another one. You're writing series of books. When you're writing a series, how far along are you in that process? Like I know that you might have okay, this is how I want it to be, this is how I want it to end. But how far are you along going, okay, book 3, I want this to happen. Book 4, maybe this.
That's a good question. When I first started writing the Pete Fernandez Mysteries, which is a PI series set in my hometown of Miami, and the protagonist is not a detective when we start. My favorite crime novels are the ones about people who fall into being investigators, and as opposed to like the polished ex-cop, steel-jawed hero. I wanted someone who was flawed and had to battle his own demons to kind of step into being a hero. So all I knew was that by the end of either the first book or the 10th book, Pete was going to decide to become a private eye. That's the arc I wanted to fill. I wanted to show that kind of year 0 as opposed to just a standard episodic adventure. You know, there's PI series where you could read them out of order and the characters don't really change. I wanted to show him having an arc, but you know, after the first one, I was like, there's more here. And then one of the supporting characters from the first book became a key member of the cast for the rest of the book. But really, I kept it loose enough so that I showed character progression each book, but I also was able to pivot and write a book about whatever I was obsessing over at the time. So the second book is a serial killer novel because I was reading a ton of serial killer books. The third book had a lot to do with Cuban history because my background, I'm Cuban American, and I wanted to reflect that, especially through Miami as well. And the fourth one was a cult book, and Miami Midnight, the finale, was a crime, like a mob book. And so I wanted to have that through line of character and also give myself enough wiggle room to... I'm the kind of writer that if I'm not obsessed with what I'm writing about, I get really bored and I can't do it. So I had to give myself room to know that, hey, future Alex, whatever you're obsessed with, you can drop it in this bucket and it'll still be a PI novel because Pete will be there. But, you know, the difference with Secret Identity, which... I didn't realize until after I was done is I didn't know it was going to be a series. I thought it was just going to be a standalone mystery set in the 70s, and by the end, without spoiling too much, there's a flash forward to the modern day. And my editor read it, and he was like, there's another book here if you want to write it. And when your editor says, do you want to write another book? You say yes. And so, and then I started kind of chipping away at it, and I realized there was another, it's the other side of the coin. So I think you just stay flexible, but have a very loose roadmap, very similar to what we were talking about with outlining. And I will say, you were talking about work for hire and license work. That's what made me a better outliner. When I did the Poe Dameron Star Wars Origin, they said we need a full detailed outline. I was like, oh, well, I don't really outline that much, but I guess I do now. And then that really informed my later stuff. So it was helpful.
And for you, David, same thing. I mean, you're writing, and you're also writing. The other thing too is you've got some detail in some of your stuff, and where Alex can kind of go back to the 1970s very easy. You're doing Wild West. You're doing worlds that might not have ever even existed.
Well, I'd like to think that I sell the reality before I sell the fantasy. So my historical novels, both the 50s PI and the weird westerns, I do a lot of research on those to make sure that they feel accurate to the time period and so forth. So when it comes to series and so forth. With my Noel Glass mysteries, that's the She Murdered Me with Science, because the first one is a play on the, She Blinded Me with Science song from the 80s, I was struggling with a title for the book, and I wanted something that had a noir feel, and I decided to take 80s songs and make them sound like they were noir novels. So the second one, which I'm working on, is called Murdered in a Mechanical World, and I'm a Mechanical Girl. And the third one is One Clone Leads to a Murder. So, I kind of had an idea of what I was going to talk about and what the plot was going to be in each one. So the second one involves robotics, the third one involves cloning. And so, that's kind of how I predicted that series. For the Drowned Horse Chronicle, Again, these are short stories that I've written over 15 years, and there's 3 distinct timelines for each of one of the volumes. And I've written stories in all 3 of the timelines based on what was the invite that I got and to write the short story. So, with each of them, I have probably about 10 stories already done. So I kind of know how they all fit together. I have an outline of the stories, when they happen, who's in it, and things of that nature, so that I can keep track of that. And then once the 3 volumes are done, I'm going to do a novel that it wraps up the whole series. So I've already kind of predicted that far out. So yeah.
Anybody that does anything creative, at least I'm hoping you guys are going to say, yeah, me too. There's some weird quirks to things. And by the way, I don't know if everybody saw the Stormtrooper and Tusken Raider walk in and look in.
That's who I was waving at.
Oh my God, they looked awesome.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
There's nothing to see.
Maybe they
here.
heard
Yeah.
Dameron and just
Yeah, these are not the authors you're looking for.
I have these weird quirks when I write. There's certain songs I have to have on, but one of my weirdest ones, and this is what I want to ask you guys, is when I know that I'm finishing up a book, and it could be about Black Sabbath. I did a book about Asia, the band UFO, my Monkey See Monkey book. Anytime I'm in like the last maybe 2 or 3 pages where I know I'm coming down to the end, I put on one song on a continuous loop, and it is What Have I Done to Deserve All This by the Pet Shop Boys. It is a song that I have had no connection with in the past. I remember when it came out, and I was a metalhead, and I'm like, that stuff's garbage. I don't like that stuff. However, that song there's something about that song. I absolutely love it now, and I've gone back and really quite understood what it was about the Pet Shop Boys that makes them so good.
Yeah.
But with that song, I will put it on a continuous loop, and my wife will hear it and be like, oh, you're almost done. And that's kind of a good thing for her. So I'm wondering if there's any of those weird quirks or any of those things that you do to kind of get yourself to the finish line on a book.
Yeah, there are. I'm not, I try to deceremonialize the writing process, like the day-to-day. I just get to my laptop, I open the laptop, and my document is ready to go, because I'm just like, I have a lot of projects going at any given time, so I need to be able to focus, and I'm not good. I don't listen to music while I'm doing it. I try not to have a lot of steps to getting to the writing. Some people are, no offense to anyone that does anything, like we all have our method, but I don't have to light certain candles or be sitting in a certain light. I don't have to be in a certain room. Like, I can be sitting on my couch, I could be sitting at my dinner table, I could be sitting in my office, and the work has to get done. But I do make really long playlists. I don't listen to them while I'm writing. I listen to them when I'm walking. And what I do is I dump songs onto the Spotify list, and I keep playing it and playing it when I'm walking, when I'm driving the kids to school, when I'm just like cleaning the house, and they help me visualize the movie in my mind, which is the book. And I do this other thing where I cast my characters, like I create a document and I put pictures, and it's kind of like a vision board. So I cast actors as the characters so I can help visualize the novel in my head. But when I'm finishing up, what I do, I very rarely pull all-nighters. Like, I'm usually, I'll wake up early, I start writing, I do my work, I do whatever I need to do, and I close up shop around 11, midnight. But if I can sense, like you see that little crack of light, and you're like, this is the end, I'm getting to the end tonight, I will stay up as late as I need to that night, and then I'll print it out and like just kind of look at it. Especially with a novel, because it's so substantive. It's like hundreds and hundreds of pages, probably months, maybe a year of your time that you've poured yourself into this document. And then I set it aside for a week, because I feel like the best edit comes after you've set it aside for a week or two, and then you can come back, and you come back to it as a reader. Yeah. As opposed to, I've just been in the trenches with this book for months, let me read it again. It's more like, would I enjoy this as a fan? And so these are pretty mundane, like little things, but they help me with the process.
And the greatest 6 letters you can ever type, at least for me, the end.
Yeah.
I do that, and I'm like, oh my God, it's done.
Bold and center, and you're good to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, David, for you, any of those things that maybe help push you to the end?
So, I rent an office to get away from my house. My house is chaos. I need to be in a space where I know that
It's a good idea.
creativity is going to be paramount. So, and I've actually opened it up to other authors. I have drop-in cubes. I have an artist space. So I've created a creative collective. And when I'm in there, immediately I feel more creative. My professor in college talked a lot about the writer hypnosis, or the writer zone that you can get into, especially if your life impedes on your creativity, which it does with a lot of people. Even with me, I have very extreme ADHD, and it is really hard at times for me to focus. So he taught me this technique, which is he calls the writer zone or writer hypnosis, where when you open up your laptop, you log into a different profile than you do normally when you search the internet or play on games or whatever. It has a different background. You might have different music that inspires you playing, and you have no other apps other than your writing app. That's it. That is the only thing you have in this profile. And what happens is you start training your brain in almost a Pavlovian way, that when it sees this particular background, hears this particular music, and so forth, it gets into that writing mode quicker. And I find I produce more words in less time. My brain knows it's writing time, and I can get a lot more done. He could get into the zone so much that actually he could tune out the whole rest of the world. He said his daughter came in one time, talked to him for 20 minutes, left. He had no idea until she's like, "So, Dad, what about that thing I said?" He's like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "I was just in there explaining." He goes, "I had no idea." And, normally we tune our kids out, but this was like really serious. So when I need to, I can do that. I also firmly believe in binge writing. If I've got an hour, I write as much as possible, and then I go vomit afterwards. So, but no, it's you gotta, when this is your job, you gotta write. You don't eat if you don't write. So you gotta find the things that help you get to that place quicker and get more done. And like you, I also set it aside. I need to forget I wrote it, so that when I do read it later, I can go, "Wow, whoever this guy is, he's brilliant."
Before I ask my next question, if anybody has any questions, feel free. I think the microphones are working. Are the microphones working?
Yes.
Okay. So if you have a question, you can go up to the microphone and ask it. And the reason that we want that is this is being recorded, so you could hear the question being asked instead of like 10 seconds of silence and then an answer to something that you don't know what's coming.
Right.
So if anybody has a question, please come up. One of the things that I have really enjoyed about my writing and what I've been doing is when you get locked into a space. Like my book is it takes place in 1979. It's me, it's myself taking and saving the world from these aquatic apes that are showing up. So it was really easy for me to cast the characters and remember what everybody was, because they were my friends. And I reached out and said, "John, remember when you ran and got clotheslined by the dog chain hanging up when we were drunk and running?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I'm putting it into the book, but you're not drunk. You're a little kid running from aquatic apes." So it was easy for me to put all these things together. And using that time period of 1979, to me, was so special because everything was slower then, and the world cycle was slower. And there's scenes in there where I go to tell my father, I was just at the Broadway Carnival and these aquatic apes things came out and destroyed the carnival. And my dad's like, "Well, we're gonna have to wait till the news at 11 to see that." And that's the world we used to live in back then. And if you're old enough to remember that, that's the way it was. And then if it wasn't on the 11 o'clock news, you had to wait till the morning paper. Mm-hmm. And I love that era. I love the fact that I was with the guys from the movie The Warriors. We did a panel, and I brought up a comment saying, how horrible would that movie have been if you had cell phones? Because it would have taken 99% of the movie out. Right. Gang trouble, we got to get back to Coney Island. Just call an Uber instead of jumping trains through every other gang's territory. Right. So with that, what are some of the things that you loved about your book took place, your series in the 1970s as well. Mm-hmm. What was it about the 70s that drew you to that time?
Well, I mean, it's a comic book mystery, so I wanted to really show an era of comics that is in direct opposition to comics today. Like, comics are so integral to pop culture. There's there's an Ant-Man movie, there's a Moon Knight TV show, there's a Peacemaker TV show. And when I was a kid, those were characters that you just never imagined being so widely known. And we go through these ebbs and flows where everyone's like, comics is dying, comics is fading away. But in the 70s, in the mid 70s, right before the direct market started, there was no secondary market for comics. You'd go to the newsstand, and if you missed the comic, it was gone. There would be like little shows, but the industry was very different. So I wanted to show a comic book world that was very different from the comics today, and show the contrast of a very different New York. New York today is definitely not the New York of 1975.
Right.
It wasn't bankrupt. The president wasn't telling the city to drop dead. The crime rate is much lower now. It's a very different atmosphere. And so that was what interested me. But in terms of like you were saying about technology, it's definitely easier to craft a mystery when someone doesn't have a laptop. They can pop open and be like, let me Google how to do this, or let me text my cop friend to figure out these things. And I'm actually seeing that much more now writing the sequel, which is set in the modern day, where the protagonist is kind of stumbling into the mystery, and I'm like, well, how do I make her checking her email exciting? Like, I've got to find unique ways to make these, that's our challenge as writers. We have to make it work. And so I have to find unique ways and interesting ways to make a modern day mystery compelling, whereas in the 70s, it's a little bit easier and the challenges are different.
And to echo that, it's so interesting to watch Scooby-Doo specifically.
Yeah.
The old Scooby-Doos we grew up on versus the modern Scooby-Doos, where they have cell phones and laptops and so forth.
Does
And
Scooby
they,
have a cell phone?
yeah, and they constantly have to we don't have a signal, right?
It's got pause on it.
Yeah, and stuff. So yeah, whereas they used to go to the library to find stuff, now they just go to their phones. But they have to, because kids wouldn't believe it otherwise. So yeah.
Mentioning the library, there's a couple things in the book in mine where I mentioned the Dewey Decimal System. And my wife goes, you do realize that no kid that reads this is going to understand what that is. And I'm like, well, when the parents read it to them, hopefully they're going to explain what the Dewey Decimal System is, much like bubble fudge and all these garbagey products we used to have as a kid.
Right.
Did you have a question, sir?
I did. One of my aggravations I have unfortunately never had the discipline to write a full novel, but I've written short stories, is noticing that characters will do things because the author or the writer wants them to do it, even though I can see there's an alternate way of doing this. Right. How much time do you spend trying to, obviously the character needs to do things in a certain way, but how much time do you say, okay, what other things could they have done and why aren't they doing them? I think it's important to eliminate another obvious solution that would have been much easier.
And that's where some of that outlining comes in we talked about earlier. If we're outlining something and then we're looking it over and we're saying, well, that's just too easy, or there's no way to get person A to place B, stuff like that. That's why you have supporting characters. If you ever studied the hero's journey, there are a lot of characters that can help in situations like that. When I teach, and I teach creative writing, when authors come to me and they're like, I'm struggling getting my characters to do this, I always ask, where's your fool? And they go, I'm sorry, what? And I said, the fool character. The fool character's number one goal in being an archetype is to get the character from point A to point B. They will do something stupid that the protagonist has to follow them and do that. Prime example, R2-D2. Everybody sees R2-D2 as this hero, but he's actually a fool. His whole job is to always get Luke to the next place. And what we hate about Jar Jar Binks in episode 1, that comes very much into play in episode 2. He's the fool character. He was there to get Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan to the next place. And so we look at that and we say, oh, who do I need specifically to help get my character out of these situations? And that's where outlining comes in.
Yeah, I would say, for me, it's always character first. I try to spend a lot of time fleshing out the character and visualizing who they are and what they are. I don't do profiles, but I spend a lot of time thinking about them. And if I find I'm in a position where the best case scenario is the character's doing what they want, and it's interesting enough, and you're basically just following the character around, writing down what they say, because they've come to life so fully that you're chronicling what they do. Obviously, within the constraints of your outline, but you want the characters to feel alive and move around and have their conflicts. I find when I'm overreaching and trying too hard to put them into things, that's when the writing feels stilted and stiff and overly plotted. As a reader and as a writer, I'm always most interested in stuff that feels natural. Like with Carmen, who's the protagonist of Secret Identity, she's not a detective. She is a writer, she's creative, but she's not the kind of person that's going to investigate a murder. So my big question is like, what would be the thing that propels her to investigate a murder? And the answer was she has something that's so integral to her creation taken away, this comic book character. So you just have to find the things that will get to the core of the character to propel them to action.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the issues that I have in trying to get the discipline of writing a novel is I've already plotted out everything in my head, and it's like now writing it is like the drudge work. How do you avoid that when you're, or do you just say, I need to do the drudge work?
It's a little bit of both. I think part of it is you outline, but you don't outline so extensively that there's nothing new. Like part of the writing part for me is a discovery. It's like, I know these are the broad strokes, but what are the weird little character things I can throw in there? Or like I said, a character comes to life and does their own thing and you're just following them around. So I think you have to give yourself enough room so the writing process is not just about the style of the words, but you're discovering more things. It's like it's a block of stone and the outline kind of chips away and you have the broad formation, but you're chiseling a little more closely when you're in the writing. So you get into the details better.
I would also say that I do this to share these stories with other people. And so for me, especially, I get excited that once I've gotten this idea, other people are going to read it, and I'm going to hope that people respond to it in the way that I responded to it in my head. So for me, it's very important to finish this stuff so that I can then let it loose in the world and see what people think. That's how I get over that, is the excitement that somebody else is going to read this and maybe pay me money for it. That helps a lot too.
And I know for me, I have on my Facebook page, it says my least favorite part about being a writer is writing. I can't stand the process because I'm not so disciplined that I can do that. I love telling a story. I love the reactions when people read it. I love marketing it. I have a degree in marketing, and that's what I love. That's my passion. So when I started writing, and when you have that idea, it almost seems like you're going to get it out. It's got to come out. You can't just sit there and say, well, I'm never going to write. I'm just going to let it go. You never can let it go. It's in you. It has to come out. There's an audience for it. And there was a competition. There's NaNoWriMo, which happens every November. And my former podcast partner, Brian Latendry, who you probably remember, Brian did this. He was smarter than I am. I'm in awe of this guy. And he would do this one year. He's like, oh, so it disciplines you from the month of November to write every single day at least 1,500 words. And what that teaches you is not to go back. You start writing, and then you end at the end of the month. And my biggest thing, probably like everybody else, was I would write a chapter or 3 pages and then go back and start cleaning it up and fixing it. 6 months later, you're still on the same 3 or 4 pages because you keep changing it. What this taught me was start and finish. Don't correct your spelling, just go in. And my spelling is atrocious. So for me, it was just getting the discipline. And then once I realized, okay, it's going to be a couple hours a day, I had to find that time when I was going to do it. I had to reconcile with the wife, and our daughters were younger at the time. So I had to kind of work around their schedules. I was fortunate enough to be finishing work at like 1 p.m. when I worked at UPS. I work at Amazon now. And I would finish up at 1 in the afternoon, and that would give me 2 to 3 hours before anybody came home. Or I had to go pick anybody up or bring somebody to soccer. So that was my time, and the discipline was there. If I didn't hit the right light, I'm like, crap, I just lost 15 minutes of writing. So creating that discipline, it was the first step for me. And then the unfortunate is once I got that down, I haven't stopped. And I keep saying when I'm done, I'm like, last one, never gonna do this again. I said this after my Sea Monkey book, and I ran into, do we have any Megadeth fans here? Anybody? Okay, so Chris Poland, who played guitar on the first 2 albums, and The System Has Failed, I gave him a Black Sabbath book. We were hanging out. The next day he came back to where we were, and he goes, I got to talk to you about the Black Sabbath book. And I'm like, oh, crap. He found a mistake, something's wrong, I did something, somebody's gonna get upset, he's mad at me. He goes, I really like this, would you like to work with me on my autobiography? And my first thought's like, I have no time for this. I don't have, yes. It came right out. So now I'm now doing something completely different and working with somebody on an autobiography. But like you guys were talking about, you have to love what you're doing and you have to feel something to it, because I get to tell the story with this guy that I don't even know. I know that he got fired from Megadeth. I know he doesn't like Dave Mustaine, which nobody really does in the music world. But I get to find out why. And that's going to be really exciting. So the discipline's there. And then unfortunately, I haven't been able to shut it off, and I wish I could.
I think one of the things too that you have to go in knowing is that the first draft is going to be bad. You know, that they call it the vomit draft for a reason. You're literally just throwing up words and hoping it comes together into some semblance of shape. And then you take a break, you come back to it, you fix it, you revise it. 2 or 3 drafts later, you will have a book that you're probably proud of existing. But if you know it's going to coming out of the gate, it's not going to be great. You're just getting words on paper. You're starting it. It makes it easier, because if you keep going back and tweaking and refining, you're never going to see the end of the line.
So I'm going to slightly disagree, but first of all, give yourself permission to write badly, to echo that. You give yourself permission to it. It's not going to be perfect, and just forget trying to reach perfect. What I do with mine is I go back 1,000 words from what I wrote the day before and start at that point, revise that before I go into the next chapter, so I get kind of reconnected with where I left off. So I do a little bit of revision along the way, but I don't, like you say, just end up in a constant loop. I'm always revise a little, then go to the next, and then the next day I revise a little bit of that and move forward from there. So thank you very much for your questions. Do we have any other questions? Anybody else? All right. Got a guy.
I have one more while he's making his way over here.
Okay.
And you could have cut right across, too.
I've been writing things and gotten, the scene was so emotional, I've actually had tears flowing down my face. Has that happened to you guys when you're writing something where you got very emotional, you might have even had to step away?
No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader.
Yeah, definitely. When you're writing, I mean, every book is a piece of you, you know, whether it's not autobiographical, but there's always elements of yourself, either in the protagonist or the secondary characters, and so you're going to feel something. And if you're not feeling anything, then maybe you should try again.
Yeah.
I had, with as silly as it is, writing my kid's book, I have a soundtrack for it, so I was sending the manuscript to some friends to put music together for it. And one of the girls who did an amazing song, I'm going to get all teary thinking about it now.
You're in a safe place, man.
This is terrible.
It's a
I
safe
am
place.
the most over-emotional person in the world. I am so bad. You should have seen me when I was a hockey player. I'd get into a fight with somebody and start crying afterwards because I felt bad that I beat them up, or I got beat up. But the thing was, I sent her the manuscript. She read it. She wrote a song for it, and she sent me the song, and I'm like, this is absolutely beautiful. I go, the sentiment, it's crazy. And I was talking a little bit about with her, and she goes, well, this is sort of like you're kind of coming to grips with your past. And I go, what are you talking about? I go, I had a great life. And she goes, oh, I'm not saying you don't have a great life, but she goes, I could sense there's some issues with your parents that are unresolved. And I'm like, because it's true. And when you write sometimes, especially I was the main character in that, and I sat there and had to do a little bit of reflection. And it's interesting because, yeah, it brings out emotions in you. And even like when I'm doing my music biographies, there might be a song that brings back something. It's like, oh my gosh, I remember that. I got dumped during Live Aid. And then I'm angry and crying.
You know, and it's funny because we need to critically analyze our own work because somebody else is going to. And if we don't critically analyze what we're doing, somebody else is going to spot it before we do. So.
Well, it's also, I mean, writing, you're not just creating out of nothing. You're pulling out of your own experiences, you're pulling from your own past, you're pulling from your own research, and we're exploring our own psyche in the process. You know, we're mining our own experiences or things you grappled with that you maybe didn't even understand. You put them on paper to kind of analyze them in a different way. So it's a very internal process that we then pull the curtain back and is very public. So it's kind of crazy.
All right.
I have a slightly different question. You touched on it a bit in terms of revision, because it sounds like there's a lot of, at least for as you've said, a lot of joy in the creation of telling the story that you wanted to tell, but the revision to get there, for some people, feels like such a slog. And there's so many difficulties going over and over and over something that you may get to the point where you're sick of.
I would.
How do
Go
you
ahead,
get through
sorry.
that?
I would actually say that the hard part is the first draft. I find that to be the really challenging, like getting the words on paper. I do it and I can do it quickly, but I really love the revision process because there's different kinds of revision I'll do. Like once I'm done and I set it aside for a week, I'll print out a hard copy and just grab a red pen and mark it up. And that's like the kind of surface read. And then I'll do it, and then I'll just make big zoomed out notes, like move this chapter over here, and then I'll revise that, do that a couple times, and then I'll do an out loud read where I'll literally read it out loud like an audiobook and mark it up as I go, because you pick things up verbally out loud that you won't pick up looking at a screen. And then if I have time, I'll do a backwards read. Well, I'll read each chapter out of order, like from the back, because you'll notice that when you're editing something, the first chunk of the book is always overly edited because you're reading it first and you're fresh, and the back half gets short shrift. So if you read backwards, and you can pick up plot, inconsistencies, like, oh, this character's wearing a red sweater, he was supposed to have a blue sweater. It's just stuff like that. And so if I have enough runway, those are the kind of edits I'll do.
I'm the exact opposite. I love the first draft, and I hate the revision process. That's the ADHD in me. I absolutely hate going back over what I wrote, but I have to. By the time my book is done, between the, going back and revising a little bit as I go along, and then the kind of edits and revision that Alex is talking about, by the time I turn it in, I will have revised it at least 7 times. And it's excruciating, those last couple, because your mind automatically fills in so much. So you have to do the tricks, like read it out loud. But also I do count on having first readers and people I trust to look it over for me. That's very important.
Yeah, beta readers are super important. Authenticity readers, people that can give you, I made this mistake as a young writer, is I would send it to a bunch of people, but you have to have a list of people that you trust that are going to be honest with you. I mean, your mom's going to say your work is great. So maybe don't send the draft to your mom. Give her the finished
My mom
copy.
said it was precious.
But have friends who are talented and who are willing to give you their time, and then be willing to give them your time too in turn. And that's kind of the back and forth. That's how we have a community.
Thank you. All right.
So we have time for one more.
Yeah, I think we got time for maybe one more. Oh, no, yes, you were that one more. But I will say, as you're coming up, again, what booth are you in? Do you know the number, Alex?
P6.
P6.
Gateway 13, just right out here.
And I'm you know where the TARDIS is? If you see that big TARDIS in there, I'm the booth before the TARDIS. So if you have any questions, please come see all of us. We do these panels because we love to talk about things, and we've gone through a lot of this stuff. And I've just gotten to know David, but I've known Alex for a lot of years, and Alex is very nurturing in things and has a lot of wealth of experience to. And your kids are young, right? You've got
7 to 4. I mean, when you were talking about having an office, I was like, I was almost drooling because I basically just, my kids will be napping or my kids will be running around, and I have to just kind of jam. Like I have 15 minutes, I'm going to just crank. But
That's
you know
the
what you
binge
said?
writing I
Yeah,
was
you just
talking
gotta
about.
binge.
Yeah.
I always tell people it's a marathon. You just got to make some progress.
like most of the people I know at this show, I've known for a long time, and telling people now, like saying to Alex, it's like, yeah, my youngest daughter just moved out 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
So we are now empty nesters. So now we're officially old.
Yeah.
You have time to write then.
Yes.
Author, editor, and exceptionally picky beta reader. But my question for you is, I always get caught up in my characters, and they take it away, and they move the story, and suddenly Joseph is like, no, I'm Johan, and there's no way I'm going to Texas. I'm going to be going to Georgia instead. Do you guys have that problem, where your characters just take over and they will not let you progress the story until you go by their terms?
So I've written some children's books. None have been published yet, but in one case, I had a character tell me he had to die. And I'm like, this is a children's book. I'm not killing any characters. And he's like, the only way the story moves forward is if I die. But I'm like, and then tears are rolling. I'm like, but I like you. Everybody's going to like you. I don't want you to die. And he's like, the only way for your protagonist to transform is if I die. And so I wrote it with tears in my eyes. I wrote that death scene. and the book was better for it. So yeah, sometimes they do that. They sacrifice themselves for you. So
I had a weird one where, because the main character is me as a kid, I was trying to figure out, how do I get my cat out of this situation? I wasn't worried about my parents, my sister, anybody else in the story. I'm like, how do I write this so my cat will be safe? And I mean, that's Minu, who I lost in 1986. And I'm still worried about how am I going to get him out of this situation. So that was one, because I was writing and just like, oh, this is the cutest. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do now?
Yeah.
I have to protect my cat.
yeah.
Yeah, I think the challenge is you don't want to seem like you're making a character do something, but as a writer, you have to do things that will make what they do believable. You know, like what's going to propel this woman to become a private eye, basically? What is the action? Or, you know, what is going to get this character to Texas? And that's the challenge. Like, what can you find that's going to, in character, make them do what you want them to do? And that's kind of the root of what we do.
All right, I think that's our time.
Yeah, that is our time. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you to David and to Alex for being here.
Thanks for moderating.
Great time.
Thank you,
Thank you.
sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, you know where we are. Just look for us if you have any more questions.
I have some bookmarks up here too.
Wealths of knowledge.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
Excelsior!